Boris Johnson rejects the European Union's request to extend the Brexit transition. He plans to go for an Australian-style WTO Brexit, and the lefties force the government to implement socialist policies. Right, as most of you know, this week was supposed to be the Brexit summit in London between the European Union officials and the UK government. Now that's been cancelled for obvious reasons, and both sides have been trying to come up with an alternative to either do a conference calling or just delay it. Now, the EU want to extend the Brexit transition. Boris Johnson so far has said no, and we now have new update on what the government wants to actually do if they don't come up with an agreement by December 2020. In this video, we're also going to be talking about something very important with all the stuff that's going around the world. Obviously, governments are trying to come up with short-term solutions to tackle this problem. That includes short-term financial support, which even as a libertarian-leaning right-winger, I'm in favour of. But the socialists are trying to force the government to implement medium to long-term socialist policies, which we cannot get rid of if it happens. So make sure to watch the end of this video, because towards the end of this, we will be discussing this in detail. Now, let's start with Brexit, because the process of the negotiation is still going on. Basically, we have a situation where the Boris Johnson's government has vowed not to extend the transition period and, if necessary, go on to an Australian-style relationship with the EU on World Trade Organization rules. A source close to the PM has told the Sunday Express that a transition period extension is not an option. This is a tough line, and the EU have said that with all the demands they have, they already find it difficult to negotiate with a normal timetable, let alone the current problem. Now, Boris Johnson has made it clear that we can still get a deal that is close to what Canada, Japan or South Korea have with the EU, where there is a tariff-free access between the two sides. But if this doesn't actually happen, then we are more than happy to go with on the WTO rules. It's similar to what America, Australia or even New Zealand have. And so this is quite concerning for the European countries, especially at this time when everybody is facing financial difficulties. Now, one of the concerns that the EU and Brussels have is what we're going to be doing with the Irish Protocol, the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And considering the government, UK government, have said if we don't come up with an agreement by June or some sort of agreement, then and if we decide to leave without a deal, then Brussels are concerned about what we're going to be doing with the border. This is what the BBC were discussing, and Laura Kunsberg confirmed that the UK now have a very strong stance, and a very, very different stance that they did before.
Somewhere where the EU is really not pleased with any progress because it doesn't see any is implementing the Irish Protocol, the backstop that became a front stop. The EU wants to see work being done on some kind of infrastructure, to see that there will be customs checks or tests or, whatever it is going to have to be. If you think about the border between Norway and Sweden, and Norway is inside the EEA, there is still infrastructure on that border there, and the EU is anxious and irritated, I think would be the adjectives I'd describe about that. So even if trade talks they've only had one yet, which is sort of basically comparing notes, but even if the tone is good there is real irritation, and that will sour trade talks if they don't see advancement, if you like, on the UK side there.
From talking to one cabinet minister about exactly that, it was pretty clear from their point of view anyway, they are going to do as little as possible. They take a very, very different attitude to how it ought to work.
Now, we are already seeing signs of concern from the EU negotiators, including Michel Barnier, who's come out and said that the divergence is a big problem.
Tout à fait franc, et je dois être franc avec vous, il y a beaucoup de divergences. Et de divergences très sérieuses. C'est sans doute naturel après un tout premier round de négociations.
Now, as you know, all of this started in terms of a deal breaker with these talks from the whole fisheries situation and the EU demanding to have access to UK's waters, and obviously Boris Johnson has said no, and now we have this current new problem in terms of the deadline and the timetable for negotiations. According to the Express, this has infuriated the EU, who are demanding fishermen from the bloc to be allowed to continue to fish in the UK waters. And we've had one of the professors at Warwick University warning the Prime Minister that his Conservative Party could lose several coastal constituencies if the UK doesn't secure a favourable trade deal for the country's fishermen. He believes that fishing rights are a key issue and could be a deal breaker, backing Mr Johnson to not relent from his hardline stance on this issue. Now, he said that a number of Conservative MPs, including some in marginal constituencies, have significant numbers of voters from the fishing community, and this extends beyond the fishermen themselves. And it is true, because it's not necessarily just about the votes that they get from the fishing industry and the community. It's actually more than that, and it is the fundamental principle of these negotiations and what Brexit is supposed to be all about. And we know that this is a key issue for France, Spain and the Netherlands, who currently use our waters. And this is why when you look at the map, this is basically the best way of looking at the stats and which countries have the priority when it comes to accessing our waters. The countries in blue are the states that could lose the most should the Prime Minister take a hard line on fishing. The countries in yellow, obviously they're slightly further out, so they don't really have that problem. And we know that the Environment Secretary, George Eustace, has already warned that he's willing to send the Royal Navy and the actual Royal Navy gunboats to protect the UK waters should the French decide to randomly come and access it. And it is getting quite serious, and as long as George Eustace is strong on this, we should be protected. But I don't think we should even get to that level. Both sides should either come up with an agreement or not and just walk away. Now, we know that the EU are using this tight deadline, especially with everything that's going around in the world, to use it as an excuse to push the UK to just say yes to all these demands. And we have to wait for the next few weeks or couple of months to see what the government would do until June. Now, speaking of current problems, as you know, most countries in Europe or in the world in general are losing money and losing political stability because of what's happening. And even the UK government, yesterday, the new Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced a big package of £330 billion to spend on this situation. Now, even as a libertarian-leaning right-winger, as I said, I'm all in favour of short-term financial support. The problem we have is that we now have the lefties trying to push the government to implement medium to long-term actual socialist policies, which you cannot get rid of the moment you implement. And one of them is the universal basic income, the most idiotic thing I've heard in a long time. And for people who advocate for these sort of things, they don't understand economics, they don't understand logic. They're going to be ruining ordinary people's lives, the same people that they're going to be helping. Now, universal basic income is everybody will get the same amount of flat income from the government, whether you work or not. And anywhere in the world that's been tried, it's failed. It pushes up prices. It brings down people's lives. And we even had Steve Baker, MP, earlier today tweeting about this because obviously now the lefties are trying to advocate and push Boris Johnson to consider this policy. Steve Baker said, those people who think that universal basic income ought to be used in this crisis need to explain how it would be delivered in time, bearing in mind the delays to universal credit rollout illustrated by the OBR in their latest report. And that's also a good point, because even when it comes to the benefit system, the government can't even implement that properly. The government can't even build a bridge properly. The government can't even do their own high-speed rail project, and let alone coming up with a plan to implement a universal basic income in the next few days or few weeks as this situation keeps continuing. Steve Baker also said that, as ever in public policy and administration, it is not enough merely to want to help people. We must do things which actually work and help. That's why Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak must use mechanisms which will actually succeed. Now, we have a lot of new politicians who don't understand economics, who don't understand how life works. Luckily, we have some of them who do. We have one of the new Conservative MPs who actually gets common sense, who was asked about this proposal, and this is her view on universal basic income.
In terms of universal basic income, I mean, it's an interesting proposition. I have three basic concerns. I think work incentives are a big one in terms of what it does by having that set amount. I think it has the potential to be inflationary. If you give everyone the same amount, are you just going to push prices up by that? And then there's also the cost. There is a pie. Obviously, if you divide the existing pie by more people, people are going to get less. The Centre for, I think, Justice Studies showed that the maximum you can afford is £6,200 as a universal basic income. Compare that to someone under universal credit, average unemployed person with 2 children, £16,000. So I think there's a cost impact here. Essentially, I'm sceptical of it.
And she's absolutely right, because it's a counterproductive policy, and the moment you implement it, it's going to be very difficult to get rid of it. And but the government are doing their short-term financial support. That's absolutely fine. That's needed. These are dark times, and but everybody needs to calm down, stay cool. We are going to pass this, and we're going to succeed at some point in the future. Now, one of the questions is what the government are going to be doing when it comes to shutting down everything, including schools. And this is what the health advisor, one of the health advisors actually said in response to this question.
So could you just give a really clear view on why schools aren't closing now, why we're doing it differently from other countries, which seem to be quite commonly closing schools, and if schools are to be closed, what the plans are around that?
When we looked at all of the interventions, we looked at the ones that had the biggest impact first, albeit with the variability that we talked about, and those that have less effect. And school closing was definitely a bit lower down the list than some of the ones that we've announced. It doesn't mean it doesn't do anything. It would have an effect. But it has all sorts of complicated effects as well, including the one that you mentioned of potentially leading to children being with grandparents and so on, and of course also causing an enormous problem not just for the workforce generally, but for the workforce in the NHS as well. So it's a complicated one, and all I can do is give the sort of science advice on that in terms of the effect.
Well, that's where we are now, and as things escalate, we will keep you guys posted. And actually, straight after this video, in about an hour or so, on our membership club, on our YouTube membership club, we are going to be publishing another video on the cover-up done by the Chinese government on this issue. So if you're a member, stay tuned. If you want to join us, if you're not a member yet, make sure you check out the link in the description, or you should be able to find the join button next to subscribe, or just go on your browser on your computer. Probably doesn't work on your phone. youtube.com/mytc/join, become a member, and you get access to extra and exclusive content like this that we're going to be publishing in about an hour or so. As usual, make sure to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell next to it. We do have a daily show at 5:45 p.m. which will stay free, and it will stay as regular as possible as long as I don't start coughing. As usual, I'm MyTC. I'll see you guys tomorrow with a new video.